Hello everyone and welcome to our new video. In this video, we are going to take a vulnerability in the Docker. Now this vulnerability was detected earlier, but this becomes relevant because the upcoming video on the C group version 2, in that we are going to understand there is a limitation of this vulnerability, okay, which we are going to explain in this video. And in that, it was a restriction due to which the C group version 2 was not initially adopted, and they waited for a kernel to get updated. On that, we will be bringing a video soon. But we are in today's video, we are going to discuss about this TOCTOU vulnerability and how does it affect and what are its effect and the repercussions in order. And this will be important to understand the adoption of the C group v2 for the Docker as well. Okay, so that being said, let's start with our video. But if you have not subscribed to our channel yet, please do subscribe to our channel to go through such technical videos on Docker, Cloud, Kubernetes, as soon as we release them directly in your YouTube, and stay updated with the latest uh, technology and the latest release and the changes within these DevOps related technologies. So that being said, let's start with the TOCTOU vulnerability. Now this TOCTOU is also referred to as time to of check and time of use. This is where it gets its name from. We are going to discuss about this. What is this time of check and time of use? So next is what is this? What is the vulnerability? Okay, so basically this is a programming bug in the Docker, and it basically comes from the Docker command line tool itself, where the copy command is having this vulnerability, which is now named as CVE 2018-15664. Now, this basically vulnerability allows the attacker to misdirect the writes intended into the container file system to the host file system. What this means is that it allows the attacker to basically gain the access on the host file system with the root. Okay, so eventually he would be able to do all of that, and just because you have used the cp command, and it can use to misdirect the files from the container file system to the host file system. And the people who are aware about it, the containers are basically run uh, in order to prevent any authorization like the access to the root within the host. That's why you do not run any credentials. So even if you are running with a non-root user, this vulnerability allows the attacker to gain the access with the root access over the host. Now this potentially basically allows the rebel to get the root level access, and he can then read and write the access to any path on the host server. Now this becomes critical because you are having multiple containers which are running on the host, and that's how basically this is the main functionality of the Docker, that you can run the multiple application containers on the same host. But then if the attacker is able to gain the root access, then he will eventually gain access to all the containers which are running on that host. And not only that host, eventually once he is into the system, then he can actually look out for the vulnerabilities in the other system and gain the access to them as well. So this vulnerability becomes important because this can allow the entire system to be get attacked, and then the attacker can make the changes into the system as per his requirement. Now, why the name TOCTOU? So technically, the exploit this works basically because the attacker has invoked a Docker CP command, and they can now plant their own symlink into a path in the milliseconds between the path is resolved and the path is actually operated on. So when you run this Docker CP command, that basically creates a symlink. Now when it creates a symlink, there are a very small period of time, which is like in milliseconds, which is available for the attacker to create a condition where when the path is actually resolved, and when it's actually operated on by the Docker. Now obviously this is very small milliseconds, but then this can well be exploited in order to gain the access. Now, this kind of security problem is known as time to check and time to use, because there is a difference between when the check actually happens on the way the sibling gets created, then when the sibling starts use. And the difference between this time to check and time to use, this is basically a race condition, right? You are getting you will have to be much faster than the processor, and you will have to gain the access and change that path to gain the access to another path which you might not be required, right? So time to use will be coming later, and that's where this vulnerabilities gets its name, TOCTOU. Now, if you want to understand this TOCTOU into more detail, so basically the attack comes from the follow sibling in scope suffers a fairly fundamental TOCTOU vulnerability. So basically the symlinks itself is having this vulnerability, and that's why the Docker CP command, when it uses the follow sibling in scope, it also gets into this vulnerability, because it is using that for the symlinks while you copy the files. Now, the purpose of following symlinks in scope is to take a given path and safely resolve it as through the process was inside the container. Now, basically here, after the full path has been resolved, the resolved path is passed around a bit and then operated on a bit later. Now, in case of the Docker CP, it is opened when creating the archive that is streamed to the client. An attacker can add a sibling component to the path after the resolution, but before it is operated on, right? So this is where the attack comes in. That is, an attacker can change the sibling, right, and gain the access, because uh, 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 now when he changes, there is a very small window of milliseconds which is available, and there he can, once he changes that path, it will be operated on, right? And because this is from the Docker, the system will allow it, right? And then you can end up resolving the sibling path component on the host as root. So this is where, you know, that path might be owned by the root user, and this is where it gets resolved as a root. In case the Docker CP, this gives you read and write access to any path on the host. Now, the scope of the vulnerability. What is the scope and how much can it affect, like who it can affect? So Docker states that this attack would only work if the container was already compromised. Now, this is one thing, that the attacker should already have that container compromised, and only if the container has already been compromised, then only this is going to work. Okay, so if the container is compromised, okay, then when you run this, Docker CP was used to replicate the container files. Okay, file copy was being made, a vulnerable window that only opens for a few milliseconds. This Docker CP basically is used for when you are copying the files, right, and you are trying to replicate the container files while the copy is being made, right? So during that time, there is a very small window which opens, and the attackers can basically use that vulnerability windows of a few milliseconds. Now, Docker is correct in stipulating that this breakout even can only happen in already vulnerable containers, because the attacker should already have access to the container, then only he can predict such a race condition. And when the Docker CP actually happens, and when the small window opens, he will have to basically hack at that very point in time. Now, however, the attackers can keep the inventory of the containers and wait for a new vulnerability disclosures. Now, this is where the things get interesting, that although you might think that this is a race condition and it provides a very small window where the attack can happen, but then when the attackers can gain the access, they can basically go into wait state for some period of time and left that container running, and eventually when they deduce the new vulnerabilities, then they basically exploit them as well and gain the access. So saying that this attack is only limited to the race condition would not be true, because then this can occur into a bigger problem, and then they can gain the access and then attack on the system and modifying the system according to their requirements, changing the files, and a lot of things can be happening from the security perspective. So it's also important to understand that the Docker runtime provides the foundation of the most modern containerized application and container orchestration platforms such as Kubernetes. Now, this is important because eventually when he gains access, right? So Docker is going to be running on some orchestration tool, and the most common one is the Kubernetes. So ultimately, even though the Kubernetes itself is secure and it does not expose anything, but a vulnerable container can lead to the access of the host itself. Now, if that once he gets the access to the host, he can then scan the vulnerabilities to the other systems which are inside the network. So it becomes important that this vulnerability which exists in the Docker container, which was having the versions previous to the Docker through May 2019 have this security hole. So if any container that was being released before May 2019, that will have this vulnerability. So if you are using a container, the latest version of the Docker container, which is after May 2019, then you will not be affected by this vulnerability. But then if any container which was created before May 2019, all those containers would be affected with this vulnerability. So they either you need to upgrade them, or there is another mitigation which is available for this vulnerability, that you should stop a container prior to running the Docker CP and remove the TOCTOU vulnerability. So basically, if you stop the container before running Docker CP, then it will be removing this TOCTOU vulnerability of the visibility where the hacker can gain the access to the root user. Now, if Docker runtime program is compromised, the attack could already take control of all the containers which are running on the Docker host. This is true because once he gains the access to the root user, then he gets the uninterrupted access to the containers which is running on that host. Now, TOCTOU vulnerability in the Docker CLI command program could be exploited by an attacker or even a rogue developer. So even the developers can exploit this vulnerability to gain the root access and then perform the different functions on the system. So it makes sense that this vulnerability which exists in the Docker should be patched, it should be fixed. You should upgrade to the latest version of the Docker if possible. If not, then you should follow the mitigation policy where the stopping of the container should occur before running the Docker CP command in order to remove the TOCTOU vulnerability, right? So this is where the TOCTOU vulnerability can be either be mitigated or permanently removed by running the latest version of the Docker. So we have discussed about the TOCTOU vulnerabilities, and there are a lot more vulnerabilities which are available. So it makes sense that you should always try to run the latest version because these vulnerabilities are publicly available, right? So the people, anyone can use it. If you are running the older version of the Docker, then they need to be updated. So that's all for this video. If you like this video, do like and share it with your friends and colleagues. And if you have any doubts related to the vulnerability, do leave in the comment. Also provide us the feedback for improving our video. That's all. Do subscribe to our channel and see you in the next video.